is a simple concept, but for centuries, poets and artists used their fertile imagination to fill in the missing details. It's fascinating what they came up with. Their dramatic and scary interpretations served as a warning and a deterrent for sinners. Is hell chock full of the wicked, or is the lake of fire reserved for really bad individuals? Well, I'm afraid the Bible is not too cheerful on this topic. Go in through the narrow gate because the gate to hell is wide and the road that leads to it is easy. And there are many who travel it. But the gate to life is narrow and the way that leads to it is hard, and there are few people who find it. I'm not a big fan of biblical literalism, and I think that hell is surprisingly empty. The arrivals level at Brussels airport has an unfortunate architecture. It crushes people. It renders people small and powerless. Travelers are forced to walk through long windowless tunnels that lead to a hallway with 2 passport control booths at the far end. When I got there, there were 200 people lining up on the right-hand side at the booth with the English sign above. Nobody was in front of the booth with the French sign. In that booth, the officer was just sitting with a smug expression, doing absolutely nothing. Resigned to their fate, more and more people joined the long lineup. There must be a good reason why nobody lines up at the other booth, they probably thought. The line barely moved, so I risked it all and went to the narrow gate. The unfriendly officer stamped my passport and waved me off. I looked back and absolutely nobody followed my example. In their judgment, it was still more reasonable to stay in the long lineup. Now, a couple of things worked against them. The architecture that subjugates people, group pressure to conform, confusing bilingual signage, and a reprehensible Belgian officer who just laughed at all these fools. Yet all of the poor victims used their best judgment. Based on the available information, they made a rational decision to stay in the long lineup. Amon Goeth was arguably a Nazi monster. Is he in the lake of fire? Here's a shoot-her scene from Schindler's List.
Unterscharfjäger.
Jawohl.
Shoot her.
Herr Kommandant! I'm only trying to do my job.
Yeah, I'm doing mine.
Sir, she's foreman of construction.
We're not going to have arguments with these people.
Okay.
Oh, shoot her! Here, on my authority.
It will take more than that.
I'm sure you're right.
He is a reliable soldier, a product of the Nazi regime. He's thoroughly brainwashed and groomed. His duty is to eliminate the Untermensch who destroy his beloved Vaterland. He's just doing his job. His order to shoot the girl makes perfect sense to him, right? Well, absolving Amon Goeth with a "he was just following orders" is a bit problematic. My grandpa's brother, Uncle Mishka, became a missionary monk, but before he could go to Papua New Guinea, he was drafted into the army and found himself in Galicia on the Eastern Front. He fell into captivity in Budapest and was taken to Auschwitz, where the Russians conveniently used the facilities to hold their POWs, and then transportation was arranged and they took them to Siberian gulags. He survived 3 years in a frozen hell. Back in Budapest, he went straight to his monastery, but it was shut down by the communists, and the monks were already in various concentration camps. So he went back to his village where his mom didn't recognize him. He inherited a small backyard garden that was possibly enough for survival, but it was taken away from him. It was collectivized. He couldn't serve as a priest. He didn't fit into the quota, and he lived the rest of his life as a janitor in a seminary in Budapest. Now, the enormous suffering and injustice could have crushed Uncle Mishka, but it didn't. Somebody could say that he was officially a man of God and he didn't have a wife and kids to worry about. And of course there was his faith, and the faith made him resilient, of course. Maybe even he welcomed suffering as his passport to heaven. After all, these Christian ascetics can rationalize everything. No, not quite. He wasn't a submissive Christian martyr material. He was a stoic character for sure, but he maintained an edge. He was very critical of human stupidity and transmuted his moral indignation into dry humor. Viktor Frankl was a successful Jewish Austrian psychologist. Before the Nazi occupation of Austria, he got an American visa, so he could have slipped away. But he chose to stay with his family. All of them were deported to various concentration camps, and only he survived. He helped the inmates any way he could so that they wouldn't give up on life. After the war, in 1946, he published his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning. Finding transcendental values, truth, goodness, and beauty, is finding the logos, meaning in one's life. And finding meaning is a central human motivational force. This doesn't just fall in our laps by a mysterious process, meditation or, awakening. We need to do things, pursuing a life task, loving selflessly, and facing suffering bravely. Self-actualization is a gift and a byproduct of doing these. My father was not an educated man, but his character was rock solid. He experienced the war and Soviet occupation as a teenager. During the harshest Stalinist era, he was a young apprentice, and then he served 3 years in the Hungarian version of the Red Army. Then came 1956, the uprising and the following communist reprisals. He has seen the catastrophe of totalitarianism and the resulting human tragedies, but at least he wasn't in Siberia. I was following his life, watching him carefully, absorbing and analyzing the rich details of his stories to learn life lessons. He was passionate about truth, goodness, and beauty. When the socialist regime collapsed, he was euphoric for months. After more than 4 decades of lies, this was the biggest thing in his life. There is God, he said. The truth is victorious. He visited us here in Canada quite often, so we took him to Ottawa. One of the ceremonial guards on Parliament Hill collapsed in the summer heat. It was a young girl face down on the grass. Nobody moved, nobody helped her, and it took agonizingly long minutes for the army medics to arrive with the stretcher. My father was in tears. He wanted to run to her and help her. So that was his goodness department. My wife and I could compile a long list of his altruistic deeds. And how about beauty? He didn't just find beauty, he pursued it, he engaged it, and he recreated it like a naive artist. He wasn't just a mere observer, he was a doer. In a previous video, I talked about the pointless lives of termite workers who don't even have eyes. Is it like the lineup of fools in Brussels? We don't know how their suffering redeems them. Wonderful people like my father and Uncle Mishka could be in that same lineup. We have to be careful with our judgments, and I don't think that God casually writes off people in large numbers. I can see Viktor Frankl, Uncle Mishka, and my father sitting on a white fluffy cloud in heaven. And Dr. Frankl tells them, "You two have done a wonderful job." Amon Goeth is nowhere to be seen. Where could he be?